Now that we have a board, I think it's time to drop some pieces in it. We can drop pieces in any column of the board, provided that column has not been filled up to the top. If we take a look at the diagram of our board again, in order to know if a selected column is valid, all we have to do is examine the first row at the location of the selected column. Let's say, for example, 3. If that location has 0 in it, that means the column is valid. So let's write a function that will tell us if the selected column is valid. Let's create a function called isValidColumn. We are going to take the board and the selected column. Then we say return board 0 column equals 0. So this evaluates to true if the column is valid and false if it's not. The next step is to determine where the piece will end up once we drop it into that column. So for example, if we decide to drop a piece in this column, and let's say that piece is from the player 1, the piece will end up in the last row, row 5. But if player 2 decides to drop a piece in the same column, this time the piece will be dropped in row 4. So we need to write a function that will give us the next available row when we drop a piece in a selected column. To do this, we are going to count up from the last row in the selected column until we find a value of 0. In order to do this, we have to know how many rows the board has. We could ask for the length of the board, but I think it will be easier if we just keep it in a constant. So let's add that at the top of the file with const, let's call it row count equals 6. Now down here, let's create a new function. Let's call it getOpenRow, and we will take the board and the selected column. Now we can use a for loop to count backwards from the last index up to 0. So row will be equal to row count minus 1, and we're going to go up to 0, so row greater than or equal to 0, and then row minus minus. Now here we can say if board add that row and that column equals to 0, we simply immediately return that row index. So now we know that the column is valid and we have the row where the piece will end up. All we need now is a very simple function to actually drop a piece in that location. So create a new function, call it drop piece, and this will take the board, the row and the column, and lastly the color of the piece that it's being dropped in. And all we have to do is say board row column equals color. Now it'll be nice to be able to test this out, so we are going to create a very simple UI that will let us select a column and drop a piece into the board, and will also alternate between player 1 and player 2. So let's go back to our component file, app.vue, and we are going to need a few more data. First, I need to know which turn is it, either player 1 or player 2. So let's call this turn, and we're going to say that if turn is 0, then the player 1 goes, and if the turn is 1, then it's the player 2. And in just a few minutes you're going to see why I'm choosing 0 and 1 for the turn. So let's initialize it in 0, so player 1 goes first. Next, I need to know what was the selected column, so let's define that. We can initialize that as 0 as well. And finally, I'm going to need a method that will actually take the turn or drop the piece in the board. So let's define that in methods, and let's create a new method called takeTurn, and let's just leave it empty for now. Now, before I move on to the UI up here in the template, I'm going to make sure that the development server is running. I can do that directly from VS Code in the terminal. So npm run serve. Okay, now that that is up and running, let's work in the UI. First, let's add an h4 which will be the label for the player whose turn is next. And I wanted to read player, well, if it's player 1, I wanted to read player 1. If it's player 2, then player 2. So this number is going to have to change. So let's create a span in here. And for this span, we can say v if turn equals 0, then it's player 1. And we can create another span just next to it. But this time we can say v else, then player 2. So basically this span with the value of 1 will show only if the turn is equal to 0. Otherwise, this one will show up with the value of 2. Now let's create a basic text input for the column. Let's give it a name of column. And we are going to tie this to the column attribute in our component. So vModel column. Finally, let's add a button below it with a label of drop piece. And once we click on this button, we are going to call the method takeTurn. Okay, let's see how that looks. Save the file. And this is our very basic UI. Now let's work on the content of the takeTurn method. The first thing we want to know is that if the selected column is valid. So if connect4 is valid column, and we pass the board, which is this board, and this column. If the selected column is valid, now we need to know the row where the piece will fall into. So let's say let row equals connect4 get open row, and again we pass the board and the selected column. Now we need to know what color of piece we are going to drop in. So let color equals, and here we have to make the decision. If turn equals 0, and it's actually this turn equals 0, then the color will be red. And we established that the color red will be defined by a number 1. Otherwise, it will be yellow, represented by A2. And already I don't like to have these magic numbers all over the place, so before we end this video, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. But for now, let's just drop the piece using connect4, drop piece, and we pass the board, the row, the column, and the color. And just to make sure it's working, I'm just going to log the board out to the console. So console log this board. Finally, we need to alternate between player 1 and player 2. So what we're going to do is say this turn plus equals 1, and then this turn equals this turn mod 2. So this mod operand here will just give me the reminder of dividing turn by 2, and that will just alternate between 0 and 1. Okay, let's save this and let's give it a try. And just a quick note, it looks like my linter is adding semicolons at the end of the lines. It's totally fine, it's not a requirement, but it's just gonna do it on its own, so don't mind that. Okay, back to the browser. Let's open the console, and as you can see, we have an empty board, but let's say we want to drop a piece in the column with an index 3, which would be the center column. And if we click drop piece and examine the board again, there you go, we have a 1 in the center column, and the label has changed now to player 2. So let's say we drop a piece again in the same column. Let's take a look at the board, and we have a number 2, and the label has changed back to player 1. Now before we end this video, I just want to clean up these magic numbers that are popping up all over the place. Let's start with the turn. We're going to define a new data in our component, and let's call it player 1, and that will be 0. And for player 2, this will have a value of 1. I think we can also define the labels for the colors. So red will be 1 and yellow will be 2. Now we can start replacing those in our code. Starting here where turn equals 0, we can just say turn equals this player 1. Then the color will be this red. Otherwise, it'll be this yellow. And I think we can do that as well in the template. If turn equals player 1, then we show this value, otherwise we show this one. And I think that's it. In the next video, we are going to draw the board and also let players select columns by clicking on them.